Well, good morning, everyone. Wanted to let you know, welcome to the Agendashift webinar. My name is Mike Alexander. I'm one of the enterprise coaches, along with Carl here at TEKsystems Global Services. He's on one side of the big pond, I'm on the other. I'm located in the United States. Wanted to let you know that, so do me a favor so we can see whether or not chat works. Would you mind letting me know who you are, or I know who you are, but where you're from, what company you might represent? That would be awesome, so I can see in chat. Today, we're going to learn about one of the best kept secrets in the world of guiding transformations in this webinar about agenda shift and outcome-oriented continuous transformation. And in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Carl Scotland. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. It's my expectation that Carl's going to be speaking for about 30 to 45 minutes. And at that time, we'll have some Q&A after the webinar, but you may have a question that's pertinent to the topic at hand at that moment. Please feel free to type something in chat or use the button in WebEx to raise your hand, and I'll be monitoring that to see if anybody is raising their hand. Would you mind doing me a favor and raising your hand so I know that you know where the button's at and I can see that it's working on our end? Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. All right, with that being said, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Carl Scotland. He leads the strategic agility practice with TEKsystems Global Services in EMEA. And he's passionate about helping businesses become learning organizations. Over the last 20 years or so, he's been a vocal advocate of lean and agile approaches to achieving this, working with companies including BBC, Yahoo, EMC Consulting, Raleigh Software, Cisco, SDL, Legal and General, Bank of America, HSBC, and Sky. I could continue on, but I think I'm going to stop there. Carl, he's been a pioneer in using Kanban systems and strategy deployment for product development. And he's a founding member of both the Lean Systems Society and the Limited WIP Society. And he's also active in the community and a regular conference speaker. Carl was awarded the honorary Brickell Key Community Contribution Award at the 2013 Lean Kanban North America Conference. Congratulations to that, Carl. And with that, I'm going to put myself on mute and say, Carl, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Good day to wherever you are in the world. Got, I think, people in the US, people in the UK. So yeah, it's just I'm gonna talk for. I've got some slides, go through 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. But if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll either pick up on them then, or we can, Mike will be keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll come back to them later. And yeah, also, always good to see stuff going on in the chat anyway, and using the kind of reactions in Mobex. Let you know what you're thinking and how you're feeling about what I'm talking about. So before we get into Agendashift itself, I thought I'd just show a little video. This is a nice fun video that I like, just to show one way we see of transformations happening, and this is something I see fairly common. So there's no audio on this, so don't worry if you don't hear anything. But yeah, use your reactions while you're watching this to let me know what you think of it. that's one way of doing an agile transformation. I think it's fairly typical. You kind of just pick something, roll it out, rename a few rules and groups, but nothing really changes, and yeah, all ends up fairly messily. So Agendashift is really trying to bring in a different way of doing that then. So it starts with 3 questions about change. And maybe just while I'm running through these, kind of reflect on them. So the first question is what if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? So typically that, in that kind of little video we just saw, we start with solutions. We kind of come in with, let's implement the Spotify model, or let's implement SAFe. And the solution just becomes all encompassing, and we don't really think about the outcomes. We kind of assume and trust that we're going to get some outcomes out of it, but we don't really talk about those outcomes. So what if we actually put agreement and talked about those outcomes before we even started talking about those solutions? And then the second question is, how do we keep bringing those outcomes to the foreground? So we don't just kind of talk about an outcome, dive into a solution, and then forget about the outcomes, but we're constantly revisiting the outcomes and reassessing, are we achieving those outcomes that we thought we were going to achieve? Are the solutions that we're trying, are they working? Are the outcomes still appropriate? Maybe the outcomes that we originally thought we wanted to achieve have changed. The market's changed, the environment's changed. So how do we keep coming back to those outcomes, bringing them back to the foreground? And then lastly, where else could we be developing and pursuing strategy? So let's not just treat answering these questions as a centralized in a centralized group, but where else did people, who else in the organization could we be talking to about what the strategy should be? And essentially, we're treating transformation and teaching our agile transformations as a more strategic endeavor, where we're looking at what are our problems, what problems are we trying to solve, how are we going to approach, what are our policies going to be in terms of trying to solve some of those problems, and then how can we include and engage people in coming up with ideas and solutions to do that? So Agendashift is really, it's designed around trying to answer these 3 questions, or certainly exploring these 3 questions. What if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? How do we keep bringing outcomes to the foreground, and where else could we be developing and pursuing our strategy for change? So what is Agendashift? This is the kind of the latest version of trying to visualize what Agendashift is. It's gone through various iterations. I think sometimes it's easier to say what it's not. It's not a big process with lots of practices and meetings and artifacts and things like that. It's very much more about strategies. It's a strategic approach. It's about a set of patterns and principles that we apply to transformation, and it's got some activities and exercises kind of baked into it, but they're not kind of processes or practices so much. They're just some things we need to do. So on this diagram, things like the ideals, obstacle, outcomes, meaning, measure, method. There are a couple of patterns that we keep using within Agendashift, and I'll come back to a couple of those. Both of those, right to left, again, is a thing. We can think of it as a pattern, and what we mean by right to left is, if you think of a Kanban board where work flows from the left side of the board to the right side of the board, we actually want to start on that right side of the board, starting with outcomes, and then working back to the left to figure out, well, what do we need to do to achieve those outcomes? So again, that's a bit of a pattern. Also, it's a principle. Round to the outside, are kind of maybe more but the principle side of things, about how do we include people at every scope and scale of the organization? How can we help people both develop strategy and pursue strategy together? That idea of putting outcomes before solutions, working backwards from key moments of impact and learning. That's a little bit about right to left. But ultimately, Agendashift is about outcomes. So the first thing we need to do, it's this kind of a bit of a paradox. We want to focus on outcomes, but we're still talking about Agendashift as a solution almost to do that. I always like to go back to, well, what do we mean by success? And this is an approach that I really like, and what we tend to use at TEKsystems. These 6 dimensions of looking at what we mean by business success. Generally, when we go into agile transformations or change organizational transformation in general, it's because we want to change something in order to be more successful. So do we want to deliver more value? Maybe we're delivering lots of stuff at the moment, but it's not valuable. How can we increase the value of what we're delivering? And agile includes lots of ways of doing that. How can we be more productive? Maybe again, teams are doing lots of work, but we're not really ever getting anything released into production, or just releasing very infrequently, or when we do release, there's very little increment in there. So how can we be more productive? How can we be more predictable? So maybe we just don't know when we're going to get stuff. And again, teams are very busy. There are initiatives and things we want to deliver, but we don't know when we're going to get them. And working on improving flow is a great way of looking at, if we've got a good smooth flow of work, then we should be more predictable. But predictability really is the outcome. Responsiveness. So maybe we're delivering things really slowly. It's just taking us a long time from when we start something to deliver it. When the company says when this is going to get done, we're saying, well, it's going to be months or years even. So the business wants us to be more responsive and deliver more quickly. Quality, we're getting stuff out into production, but there's low customer satisfaction, lots of defects, lots of support calls that our support centers having to deal with. And then sustainability, that idea that we want to be able to continue doing this work over the long run. So it's all very well, we can do stuff now, and we're doing lots of putting sticky tape on things to get stuff out, but it's not sustainable. So maybe we just need to be a little bit more forward thinking. So we talk about these things as 6 dimensions of business success. And generally, when I start talking about transformation, this is the starting point. This is like, well, which of these things are important to you? And then we can work back and say, well, okay, let's bring in something like Agendashift to see what we can learn from there and how we can use some of those patterns and principles and activities that Agendashift includes. So there's 3, I guess 3 ways that I think Agendashift is different to typical approaches, and the 3 things I tend to like to emphasize. The first of those, it's about inviting and engaging people into the transformation, rather than imposing change and inflicting change on people. So how do we have a transformation where people want to take part in it? And there's this really nice bit of research done by McKinsey, they call the people power of transformations, and they surveyed people and they said, have you been involved in a transformation? Was that transformation successful? So kind of asking people's own opinions of whether they thought the transformation was successful. And then how engaged were you in that transformation work? What they found is that I guess the bottom 2 boxes here, I'll just kind of put a little laser pointer around these boxes around here, the really interesting ones, because this is saying that 82% of people were engaged in a successful transformation that were in a line manager role. So if you look at all the line managers, 82% said they were engaged where it was successful, but only 50% of people said they were engaged when it wasn't successful. And similarly, those frontline employees, 73% of people said they were engaged when they thought the transformation was successful. Only 46% of people were engaged when they said it was not such a successful transformation. So it's fairly subjective on what do we mean by success. We're asking people to judge. They were asking people to judge success themselves. But I think there's a kind of fairly interesting correlation there. And their conclusion is employees and overall tend to be more engaged, especially at lower levels of the organization, for successful transformations. And Agendashift is really trying to tap into that then, engage people at all levels of the organization, get them involved, so that we hopefully have a more successful transformation. So there's a number of ways Agendashift does that. Get rid of the pointer. First is that Agendashift has the idea of a true north exercise. So one of the first things, and this is kind of one of those activities that an Agendashift workshop will do, is to get people talking about what's it like to work at their ideal best. So imagine everybody is able to work consistently at their ideal best. because I think it's a fair, safe assumption that people want to do their best work and we be able to work at their best. Maybe we'll kind of think about what this means for you as I go through them. There's 3 elements to this: individuals, teams, between teams, across the organization, and beyond. So it's not just saying, well, you working as your ideal best on your own, but what does it mean for your team to be working at its ideal best? And where we're working at scale, and we have teams of teams, what does it mean for working at best between those teams, where those teams are coordinating and collaborating? What does it mean for that to be its best? And then you've got the wider organization. What does it mean for us as an organization to be working at its ideal best? And even beyond the organization, what does it mean for our customers to be working at their ideal best? So we can think of this at lots of different scopes and scales about what does it mean to be working at our best? And this is really trying to get people to think about, what's in it for them? Because if we can get people to think about what their ideal best is, then we can look at how do we transform such that people can work at that ideal best. And we can start understanding where people don't think they're working at their ideal best and start looking at how can we bring in new ways of working that are going to start resolving that. So the second aspect is having the right conversations with the right people at the best possible moment. So the other side of this is people generally don't like being stuck in meetings when they're not really having any conversations, they're wasted times together, or they can't have the conversation with the right person at the right time, and they can't get the information that they need, or they get information too late in the day and it's a big surprise. So just imagine that we're collaborating really effectively and we're talking to the people, talking to the right people at the right time and getting that the right information and the best information possible at the best possible moment, not too early, not too late. And the last aspect of this is needs anticipated met at just the right time. So trying to get the right balance of planning, so we're not doing lots of planning up front and we're wasting our time there, but equally we're not getting surprises and we're not finding things out at the last minute. So anticipating what we need to do, when we need to do it, what information we need. So those are 3 ways of looking at working at our ideal best. And one of the exercises, what's called the True North exercise, is just getting people to reflect on these 3 areas of working at their best, making some notes, and then sharing that with each other. And typically some themes and some commonalities will come out with that, and that starts getting people aligned and engaged in, okay, now I know why we should go through this transformation, and now I know what's in it for me. So that's one way of engaging. The other way is the Agendashift assessment, and this is a kind of fairly key part of Agendashift, and in some ways it's one of the most concrete bits. I'll put a link up there, and we'll share this link again at the end, and we can probably share it by email, and we'll share the slides at the end. That's like a little sample mini assessment that you can go in and play around with. Agendashift, I find the Agendashift different from most assumptions, and partly it's inclusive. So we're not just assessing individuals, we're talking about assessing ourselves as teams and assessing ourselves as an organization. So it's not really trying to focus too much on the individual. It's very non-prescriptive. So it's not assessing yourself against a set of practices, like how well do you do stand-up meetings, how long are your stand-up meetings, and therefore it's also very framework agnostic. So you can apply it really to any context. I know kind of people, other Agendashift coaches who've gone in and used Agendashift with even non-software, because really they're just a set of questions that talk about outcomes and how well teams, groups can achieve outcomes. And what you get out of the assessment is a really simple way of debriefing. So again, this is the inclusive element of it. There's no right or wrong answers in here, but it's a way of engaging the teams to have conversations with them about how they've scored the various questions and the various sections, and what their reflections are on that, and also where the strengths are as well as the weaknesses. So the assessment is a set of prompts, a set of questions that are very outcome focused, and then you're asking people to rate them on a very simple scale of 1 to 4. So there's not too much thought involved. 1 is used means we don't do this at all. We don't achieve this outcome. 2 is, well, early days, we do a little bit of it, but you know, we're still learning. 3 is, yeah, we're good at this, we're okay at this, but we've got room for improvement. 4 is, actually, yeah, we're pretty good at this. So you're asking just people to reflect on various aspects of the work and the way they work, and then what this kind of first screenshot gives you a really high level of how are we doing generally, and it's got across these 6 areas: transparency, balance, collaboration, customer focus, flow, and leadership. So there's 6, or in the full survey there's 6 or 7 prompts across those 6 areas. And we can start seeing where are the patterns, where, you know, are we good at transparency or not so good at transparency? You know, is our strength collaboration or balance? So this is another view which lets you get into that. You've got those 6 sections, and then it does a little bit of maths in the background, gives you some kind of median scores, but also the dark blue and the dark gray scores give you some insight into the diversity or differences of opinion. And this goes back to the idea that there's no right answer on any of this, but what you're looking for is, like, well, if somebody thinks we're strong and somebody thinks we're weak on something, that's a good place to have a conversation and understand, well, what are different people, what are people's different experiences or interpretations or perspectives on this. So you're starting to kind of get into having conversations, and you can get this down to the sort of prompt levels, where you can look at the prompts around. Prompt 1.3, we've only scored 1.8, but actually there's a potential, and some people think we're a little bit higher. Getting people's examples, getting people to tell stories, and through that, it's all part of this engagement, and you're finding out what's really going on, what's happening on the ground in the context, and that gives you some really powerful information to start understanding about what things might be good options and good ideas for things to change. So that's the assessment. And then one of the things we do with the assessment is use this little exercise. Again, this is an Agendashift based exercise called 15-minute photo. This is based on, a lot of these questions are based on clean language. So I know Judy is more of an expert. Judy is on the webinar, much more of an expert in clean language than me. But we take it as a very, very, very simple way of using these clean questions. So clean questions are really open, no bias involved in them, and we can take one of those prompts and talk about the obstacles that are getting in the way of those prompts, and ask the question, what would we like to happen? So we're starting to work with teams to flip them from talking around where the weaknesses are, where the areas of opportunity are getting in the way of those areas of opportunity, and then flipping into outcomes. So what would we see, what would we like to have happen, which would demonstrate that we're moving things and things are getting better. And then there's other questions around, well, what kind of, you know, if we say we have an obstacle around, you know, I don't know, let's say we don't know where dependencies are, what would we like to have happen? We'd like to have more visibility. We can then go, well, what kind of visibility? What's happening when you have visibility? When you have visibility, then what happens? And we kind of gamify this into a little 15-minute exercise that starts generating lots of ideas. And I guess that's another principle behind Agendashift. It's very generative. There's lots of questions, and you'll see a lot of these slides of just lots of really powerful, interesting questions that you can ask and work teams to get them to generate the ideas themselves. And then again, that's engaging them, and that's inviting them, because they're really kind of coming up with the content and the solutions themselves. So we've talked about kind of inviting people and engaging people. The other thing that I think is different with Agendashift is the idea of acting in the present. So what do I mean by that? So when we come in transformations, and we come in with a very kind of solution focused approach, we're effectively trying to envisage some ideal future state, and we just want to talk about closing the gap between the current state to the future state. The alternative that, and Jay Bloom, a guy called Jay Bloom, has called this as present thinking. Rather than thinking about how do we get from a current state to an ideal future state, it's how do we get from the current state to an ideal current state. So we're not really changing anything, but it's more about what can we do now and today to move to an adjacent possibility, something that's just a better version of today rather than a better future. And then once you move to that ideal current state becomes the new current state. And then you can ask again, well, how can we move from the new current state to another ideal current state, and so on. So you're taking a very small step-by-step process, really focusing about what can we do today to make today better. And then each step in the journey then can evolve and can be different. So we're not trying to predict the future, we're just trying to make today better. And for me, that's a very powerful way of thinking about how we approach change, and Agendashift is really taking that perspective on change. Obviously, you still need to have a sense of direction. So we're not just kind of like a drunk walking around taking random steps. We do want to have a sense of direction. We do want to have an idea of, are we moving in that direction? And that's kind of really probably what the idea of outcome oriented is. We need to be, and I very intentionally talk about outcome oriented rather than outcome driven. It's very much about having that orienting towards the outcome we want to get to, and moving towards an idealized future, but it's not an ideal future. So we're trying to make the future better, but without trying to predict it. And there's an exercise called the 5W celebration. So it's like a time travel exercise. Imagine that it is the future and we have achieved our outcomes. Well, actually, what are we celebrating? What's that big breakthrough that we've made and that's become possible that we want to achieve and that would be worth celebrating? When would we be having that celebration? What's the time frame that we're thinking about? Are we talking about months, years? And we probably want it to be a reasonable time frame in terms of not too soon. So I've done this, and teams have they've celebrated getting their sprint goal done. And sometimes that tells you as much about the team as as anything. But I tend to find 6 months to a year is a good time frame that's going to give us something meaty to get our teeth into. The slides seem to be having a mind of their own. So who's celebrating with us? And that's starting to understand, who do we need to work with? What's the organizational scope, identity, who's going to support us, who's going to be involved? So probably we're going to need help to go through this transformation. Who do we need help from? Where are we celebrating? This is kind of generally a little bit of a fun part of it, but you still kind of can get some interesting insights into whether teams would rather celebrate in their local pub or whether they'd rather travel to the Caribbean or some other exotic location. And lastly, just why is this important? Why would we even go through this exercise, this transformation, and do something that's worth celebrating? So that's really getting down to the essence. Again, we do this with teams, and you're starting to try and get some alignment with the team as to what direction we want to move towards. Different people have different ideas, but generally some themes and some patterns emerge, and everybody starts going, okay, yeah, I know why we're doing this. I know what the intent is. I know why it's worth doing this. So that's a nice exercise to get people outcome oriented so that you can then start working in the present. And then this mnemonic, I do. So this is one of the patterns: ideal, obstacles, outcomes. The ideal part of that is envisioning a compelling future. So something like that celebration exercise that I just described is trying to envision an ideal future, an idealized future. But it's not a future state. It's not a future solution. It's what would the world be like when things are better. Having identified that, then we come back to the present. So what are the obstacles? What's stopping us moving towards that idealized future? And then once we understand those obstacles, we can then start saying, well, what would we see? What are the short-term outcomes if we can start removing those obstacles? And that's then moving on to that idea of acting in the present and adjacent possibilities. So actually, if you start off with the True North exercise, that's another little example of the ideal. So True North gives us a feel for the ideal. The survey and the assessment gives us a way of identifying obstacles and what are the key areas that we might want to spend our time on. And then that 15-minute photo exercise helps us to shift towards outcomes. So that's a kind of a fairly common pattern in it. Again, it works at every level, and it's fairly recurring in some of the exercises. And it's just a really nice way of thinking about how do we generate ideas in a coherent way that engage people, and people can kind of go, okay, I know what we need to do. I know what the short-term outcome is. I know why we're doing that and what the long-term goal is. So there's some questions again that are included in this. Again, what's it like when it's working at our ideal best? The True North does that, but we can ask that about some individual prompts in the survey. If the team or the group you're working with says this is a really important prompt for us to work on, we can ask the ideal question: what's it like when that prompt is working at its ideal best? Whose needs will be meeting? So who's involved in this? What new stories could they tell? So bringing in a narrative element to this to help understand the ideal. Then the obstacles bit as well. What's stopping that? What's getting in the way? So generally, we'll kind of get teams to brainstorm things on sticky notes, come up with lots of obstacles. Again, it's being very generative. And then that clean question again, what would you like to have happen? And then what happens? So what are the outcomes that would we like to start moving towards? Short-term outcomes, ideal current state outcomes that help us to move towards the ideal. So just asking these questions and reflecting on these questions with a team in a workshop is a really powerful way of kind of getting teams engaged. So the last piece then is running experiments. So a bit of information theory, why run experiments. This is something I picked up from Don Reinertson that I kind of constantly come back to, this idea of failure and information generation. So failure is sometimes kind of seen as a negative thing, but I think this puts it in the context of why it's why it can be positive. If we're kind of down here, and our probability of failure is 0%, that generally means we know everything. We know everything, we're doing everything right, which means we're not generating any new information. And there are some times when you want to be there. So this is all contextual. The example I normally use is when I get in an airplane, I want the probability of failure to be 0%. And so far it has been. But I'm hoping that the pilot's not learning how to fly and they're not figuring out how to build a new plane while I'm in it. Equally, at the other end, if your probability of failure is 100%, again, you're not learning, you're not getting any information because you're failing and you're just ignoring the reasons for that failure and not doing anything differently. So it probably just means you're doing the same thing over and over again that's continually failing. The sweet spot is in the middle, where that probability of failure is around about 50%, because it means we're trying things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't work, we look at what information and what learning we've had, and we use that learning and we do something differently, and hopefully doing something differently will work again. So that sweet spot of learning is that 50%, which means when we're going through an organizational transformation, we want to be learning about what are the right things to do in that context for that organization with that group of people. Not everything is going to work every time. So the video at the beginning is basically an approach to transformation which assumes you've got nothing to learn, you don't need any new information, and it's just going to work. And my experience is that that's very rarely the case. So this is where this idea of meaning, measure, method, this is one of those other Agendashift patterns comes into it. And I think of it as, how do we avoid confirmation bias? So sometimes it's very easy just to jump to the right solution again. And then when we're doing that solution, we just look for evidence that our solution is right. So this meaning, measure, method pattern and approach kind of helps avoid that. So we start off with the meaning, and the meaning is why is it important to work on this? So that might take you back to the survey and some of the prompts. It might be to do with your idealized future and your celebration, but why do we want to do something? And then we move to the measures. So what would we see or hear if we're moving in the right direction, if we are making progress and the things we're trying are working? There's a magic question, is like, if this obstacle went away, what would be the first thing you notice the next day? So if suddenly magic happened, somebody waved a magic wand and something had got better, what would you notice? Those things can become your methods, and then you can get into what solutions should we try, what ideas do we have to do things differently, which we think will generate the measures that we think are the right things to kind of deliver the meaning that we want. So it's just deferring that idea of coming up with methods and solutions as long as possible, because our natural instinct is to kind of go, I know what the answer is. And not only do we then kind of jump straight to the method, but then when we're looking at how do we measure the method, generally those measures are more about, are we doing the method right, than is the measure working? So it just avoids that confirmation bias. So identify what you really want to do, explore why it's important to you, then identify how you'll know that you have it, signs of emergent indicators of progress, and then use those to figure out what solutions might we try. And then that takes you into running experiments. And I like this kind of definition of experiments, small safe default tests to learn about which improvements are technologically or operationally feasible, and which ones aren't from the many adjacent possibilities. So you've kind of got that idea of acting in the present. There's many things we could do. Not all of them are going to be appropriate. Not all of them are going to be even technically possible. Some of them are not even going to be operationally possible. So which ones are we worth trying? Try them, learn about, are they possible technologically, operationally? Is it an adjacent possibility? 50% of the time, you're going to be right. 50% of the time, you're going to be wrong. And using these A3s just helps us have a little bit of discipline about doing that. So we have a hypothesis. We think about, again, there's this idea of anticipation. We're not going to just do things randomly. Let's anticipate the risks that we may have, downsides and upsides. Anticipate and make sure we've got the right people involved. Think about and anticipate assumptions and dependencies. And then that leads you into things we're going to try, the pilot experiments. And it might be that those pilot experiments are there to validate your assumptions. Those pilot experiments might be there to start looking at how do you resolve those dependencies. Those pilot experiments might be how do you start addressing some of the risks, or how do you engage some of these people. And then ideally, you can capture the insights at the end of the experiment, or you can start thinking around what insights do we want to generate from this experiment? What do we hope to learn, kind of bringing it back to that idea of learning. So that kind of been a fairly high level run through Agendashift, and just some of the exercises, techniques, patterns, principles, and why Agendashift is the way it is. And again, it comes back to these: put an agreement on outcomes before solutions, keeping those outcomes to the foreground, and a lot of the, there's lots of other exercises, mapping exercises that help us do that, and obviously running experiments is constantly kind of reviewing the experiments about why are we doing that, are we achieving these outcomes, and then engaging as many people as possible and across the organization to think about these things from a strategic perspective, and how do we both develop the strategy and pursue the strategy and learn about the strategy. So which elements of the strategy are working or not. So this really kind of what this looks like in reality is typically a workshop or a set of workshops. So this is the way we tend to do this, or like to do it, which is split it out across 5 days, but they're not 5 full days, they're kind of half days, 3 or 4 hours. Day one is really about getting everybody on the same page. So that's where we would do that celebration exercise. There's kind of looking at people thinking about what the breakthroughs do we want to achieve, what are our key challenges, what's the purpose, looking at obstacles, and there's a kind of whole exercise around good obstacles and bad obstacles. But what we don't want to do is, we're trying to avoid here is blaming people, and again, just jumping solutions. So kind of saying the obstacle is that we don't have a solution in place is not necessarily a healthy approach, and then starting to just think around moving from those obstacles to the outcomes. So if day one is kind of really high level, day two then kind of gets down to more detail. That's when we would generally debrief the assessment, really kind of start talking about, well, what's going on now, and doing an exercise called challenge mapping to understand what causes things, what's the benefits of doing things, how we might start thinking about approaching things. And then we get into that strategy piece on day 3 around different mapping exercises, around how do we approach the solution, what are the relationships between all these things, and going into the challenge mapping a little bit more just to kind of show how everything is hopefully coherent. Day 4 then starts getting us into action. So actually, okay, given everything we've learned and come up with so far, what hypotheses do we have? And starting to developing that thinking, but also thinking about what are the small things we can do? What are the things that we can do today? And this is the idea of 5% outcomes, 15% solutions. So what is a small solution which will give us a small outcome, but will take us a small step in the right direction, will generate a small amount of learning, but that we can then build on. And then day 5 is about getting into, well, okay, once we've done this workshop, what happens next? Actually, how are we going to generate the insight and learning? What cadence are we going to put in place? Where are we going to start? How do we continue to invite people, begin this process, and ultimately continue this process? So we pull a group of people into this workshop. The half hour kind of days means that people have some of time between the different sessions, partly just to kind of go back and keep up on their day job, so we're not taking people completely out of it, but also just that reflection that happens in the background, that means that as you get into the next day's workshop, there's been some thinking that's gone on as well. And then within a larger engagement, just the workshop on its own, doesn't help. So we'll typically do some work before the engagement, just to start making sure who needs to be involved in the workshop, who are the right people, engaging early engagement of them, inviting them and making sure they know what they're being invited to, and then starting to distribute and get people completing the assessment. The workshop then will be work 3, and then there's usually a bit of follow-up debrief, pulling together some, here's what we did, here's the decisions we made, and planning the next steps. And then we want to go into, and I kind of think about this as a cadence of accountability. We come back roughly, the end of every month and kind of go, okay, what have you done? Because this is really about us engaging organizations so that they own their own transformation. Again, not us coming in as external experts saying, just do this, we know the answer. We're helping organizations figure out how to do this for themselves. So this monthly visit just kind of keeps some accountability around, well, this is what you said you were going to do. What have you actually done? What progress you made? What learning have you generated? And then what difference does that make? How do we need to update our plans? And then that kind of goes on to a, maybe 6-month engagement where we can kind of wrap up and kind of go, okay, well, what have we learned from that? What can we do differently? Next steps, etc. So just wrap up. I think I've talked for way longer than I planned to. Nice little quote just to finish. Anybody in the chat recognize this quote? Can I give you a chance? Where's this from? Who said this? Anybody? All right, I'll not leave you hanging. This is Anna from Frozen 2. So this is sometimes kind of called the Frozen 2 strategy for them change, but it's that idea of just taking one step. What's the next right thing you can do when we don't know what to do? Let's just do something that we think will move us in the right direction. And as we take a next one step and the next stop, hopefully we'll learn and we'll figure things out and we'll get there in the end. So hopefully you'll all go back and watch Frozen 2 now after this webinar. So that's it. I think we've got time and I can see a few questions in the chat. Just on this slide, and we'll share this, and I think Mike might even put in these links. There's an email address if you want to email us about anything. This is the best way to get hold of us. That's the link to the survey. So that's just it's a mini survey. There's just a couple of questions per section, but I'll give you a feel for hopefully the style of the prompts and how it's kind of inclusive and non-prescriptive. And then we do have a data sheet. So this link here, this is the second link that Mike's put in the chat. Just a one-pager, just a little bit more about Agendashift and the way we approach it.
Thank you, Carl. Great job. Just wanted to let's go over some of the questions that we have in there. Daryl had a few things that he mentioned. One of those, which really touched me, is in my experience, most leaders and managers can't articulate outcomes. They think in terms of outputs, aka deliverables, and in this is where they need the most help. And I totally agree with you, Daryl. And one of the things that hit me during this transformation was the one of the first slides. What if we put an agreement on outcomes before solutions, and somehow make that part of the working agreement whenever you start talking to somebody? Daryl did ask back when you were talking about some of the measurements, how adaptable is the aspirations model? Some companies want to see DEI as a measure of success, for example. Daryl, would you mind telling us what you mean by DEI?
Yeah, sure. So DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So
Thank
I
you.
know a lot of organizations are um, having this as part of their kind of top outcomes or areas of focus. So when I saw your model there, that's one thing I thought was potentially missing, also sustainability.
Yeah, that would be my hunch. And I guess this is, it's not it is very high level and kind of fairly abstract. So, it's almost kind of more of a typology of just kind of getting people to think around their outcomes. But yeah, my that's probably where I would start with, kind of going. DEI really is about sustainability of the organization, but maybe again, there's a lot of measures that fit in multi-layered areas. You could argue that one of the reasons we want diversity is to generate more value, because diversity of opinion, diversity of experience brings things which bring us value. Or maybe it's, I could probably, if I wanted to, I could argue that DEI fits across all of these things. There's probably a quality aspect in there,
Yeah.
in that, diversity or kind of give different perspectives on what quality means. So yeah, good. I kind of love that way of bringing things into it, though. And that is a my slides really do have a lot mind of their own. Yeah, we kind of got a little group that kind of is working on these or talk. We get together regularly and talk about these things, and that's kind of one of the topics that usually comes up is what examples would we use in these things. And my approach is it's that in itself is contextual, but this gives a kind of I find this gives a frame which pretty much covers all the bases, I think.
No, I like the way you answered that, because yeah, I can imagine a workshop where someone says, "Well, what about diversity?" And you said, "Well, the result would be better value if we had a more diverse um, teams, and we are more inclusive." So, in itself, DEI is not an outcome; it is perhaps a value or a set of principles that you're going to apply in order to achieve these outcomes. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So
It may
thank
be
you
a
for that.
necessary leading indicator of what that value may be or may not be without a proper DEI. So that's a good point.
Mm.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of richer topic there about leading and lagging indicators. But yeah.
Mm.
And Daryl has another question that may take us to the end of our time here. Any war stories, Carl, that you might have in approach of using this in the business world?
Um, yeah. I mean, I think this is hard. It's like, because you're by asking organizations to own their transformation, there's a bigger investment. Now, I think there's the return on that investment is huge, but if organizations just run the workshop and then just don't have the time and invest the time to run the experiments. And that's one of the reasons we kind of build in that little kind of period of I call a cadence of accountability, just to kind of go back and kind of going, well, if you don't actually do anything, if you're not prepared to invest the time to run these experiments and make these changes, you're not going to change. But a lot of organizations, I think, are just so busy that they're not really prepared to invest the change. And they and sometimes it's, they just want, if somebody could just define the blueprint, it kind of goes back to that the Spotify video. If somebody could just define the blueprint and then everybody just does that, things will be better. But it's not. So yeah, I think that's, in terms of kind of war stories around Agendashift, those are generally the challenges, and where it works best is where we have a kind of a longer term engagement where we can carry on working with them. The ones that I kind of see less successes, where I run the workshop and then I see the resulting store from a distance and not a lot happens.
Okay, no, my angle on that question was where I've been working for the past couple of years. They've been on an agile kind of transformation for the past 5-6 years. So when I tried to introduce a kind of a business agility assessment, they were like, "Oh, not again." We had that sort of like 5 years ago, and there was this kind of fatigue of, we think we're far along already, but I could obviously see lots of gaps and issues, but I wanted some objective way of being able for them to own that in the way that this approach does. So yeah, so it's I guess my question was more around have you got experience of in teams that have got this kind of fatigue around working on a transformation towards agility?
Yeah, Daryl, we never see any of that. All the people are just ripe and ready for a new transformation every time we walk in. They've not done it before, and I am joking, by the way.
Of course.
Yeah. I think there's two levels. Like, one is actually just survey fatigue, and where sometimes you're just like, another survey. Yeah, we have our organizational survey, and actually a lot of those, employee engagement surveys that people are cynical about because they fill it in every 6 months, a year, and they never see any changes, or changes get talked about, but then they never get involved. And again, people are used to having change inflicted on them. So yeah, we definitely see that. I mean, I guess, my general response to that is this is why Agendashift is the way it is, to try and counteract that a little bit. But yeah, you have to engage people. So there's a bit of a paradox there. People not willing to be engaged, you can't engage them. But generally, once people realize that there's something in it for them, and that you're not just kind of making them to do agile and they don't want to do it, but actually there's some benefits here, and this is going to make their lives better, and you're actually addressing something that's meaningful to them. It kind of breaks down the resistance. But often, as I said, then the challenge becomes actually people having the time to do this.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you for answering those questions.
Awesome.
No problem.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat at this point in time, unless somebody has something that they want to pop up and say something about. Please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to give you 3 minutes back. Awesome.
Well, maybe let me just kind of
Sure.
quickly flip forward just to the just in case people want to. Well, let me shove this slide up again. We'll certainly send the slides out, which will have these links on, and then as Mike said at the beginning, I'm hoping that we can put this recording somewhere public, but yeah, we'll certainly let you know how you can access it.
Yep,
that's great.
certainly.
Thank you.
Thanks
I
very
think
much.
it's a great webinar. I think it is. I think it was very professional, awesomely done, and so we probably will make this available to everybody else. Look forward to seeing something like that in your email boxes, folks. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody have a great day.